The morning air was cold and crisp as Sarah Mitchell walked through the long hallway of Sunset Care Home. Her white shoes squeaked softly against the polished floor as she carried a tray of morning medications to room 17. She had been working as a nurse at this care home for 3 years now, and she knew every resident by name. But there was something special about the man in room 17 that always made her heart feel heavy. Thomas Bennett was 94 years old and had been living at Sunset Care Home for the past 2 years. His room was simple and clean, with just a single bed, a small wooden chair, and a dresser that held his few belongings. On top of the dresser sat 3 faded photographs. One showed a young man in military uniform with a bright smile. Another showed the same man standing next to a beautiful woman in a white wedding dress. The third photograph was of 2 small children playing in a garden somewhere long ago. Sarah knocked gently on the door before entering. Thomas was sitting in his chair by the window, looking out at the small garden behind the care home. He did this every morning without fail. His gray hair was neatly combed and he wore the same brown cardigan he put on every single day. When he heard Sarah come in, he turned and gave her the same gentle smile he always did. "Good morning, Thomas," she said as she placed his medications on the small table beside his chair. "How are you feeling today?" Thomas looked at her with his kind blue eyes and nodded slowly. "I am well, dear Sarah," he said in his soft voice. "Thank you for asking." His voice carried the weight of many years, and Sarah could hear both strength and sadness in it. Sarah had learned Thomas's life story over the many months she had been caring for him. He had fought in the war when he was just 19 years old. He had been brave and strong and had helped save many lives during the most difficult battles. When the war ended, he came home and married his childhood sweetheart. Mary, they had been deeply in love and had built a beautiful life together. Thomas and Mary had 2 children, a son named James and a daughter named Elizabeth. The family lived in a small house with a garden where the children played and Mary grew roses. Thomas worked hard every day to provide for his family. He was a carpenter and was known throughout their town for his skill and honesty. People trusted him to build their homes and repair their furniture. For many years, Thomas and Mary were very happy. They watched their children grow up and go to school. They celebrated birthdays and holidays together. They took long walks in the evenings and sat together in their garden on Sunday afternoons. Thomas would tell Sarah about how Mary used to hum while she cooked dinner and how she always left little notes in his lunchbox when he went to work. But life can be cruel sometimes, and tragedy came to Thomas's family when he was in his 50s. Mary became very sick with cancer. The doctors tried everything they could, but the medicine did not work. Thomas stayed by her side every day and night, taking care of her and holding her hand. When Mary died, Thomas felt like half of his heart had been torn away. The children tried to help their father through his grief, but they had their own lives to live. James moved to another country for work, and Elizabeth got married and moved far away with her husband. At first they called Thomas regularly and visited when they could. But as years passed, the calls became less frequent and the visits stopped altogether. Thomas lived alone in the house, where he had been so happy with Mary. He kept her photographs on every table and continued to tend the rose garden she had loved so much. He would talk to her picture every morning and tell her about his day. Neighbors would sometimes see him sitting alone in his garden, and they felt sorry for him, but they were busy with their own lives. As Thomas got older, his health began to fail. His hands shook and he could not work as a carpenter anymore. Walking became difficult and he could not take care of the garden or the house the way he used to. Social workers came to check on him and found that he was not eating properly and could not manage on his own anymore. That was when Thomas came to live at Sunset Care Home. He did not want to leave the house where he had so many memories, but he had no choice. He packed his few important belongings, including the 3 photographs and his old military medals. He left behind the house and the garden and all the memories they held at the care home. Thomas was polite and kind to everyone. He never complained about the food or his small room. He never asked for special treatment or caused any trouble. But Sarah could see that he was deeply lonely. His children never visited him. They never called or sent letters. It was as if Thomas had been forgotten by the world. Other residents at the care home had families who came to visit them. Children and grandchildren would bring flowers and take their elderly relatives out for drives or meals. Thomas would watch from his window as families hugged and laughed together in the parking lot. Sarah noticed that his face would become very sad during these times. Thomas often told Sarah stories about his life during the war and about Mary and their children. He would describe the battles he had fought and the friends he had lost. He would talk about how proud he had been to serve his country and protect the freedom that people enjoyed today. He spoke about Mary with such love that Sarah could almost picture the beautiful woman who had stolen his heart so many years ago. But what broke Sarah's heart the most was when Thomas would talk about his fears. He worried that when he died, no one would remember him. He was afraid that his grave would be empty and forgotten with no flowers or visitors. He told Sarah that he had lived a good life and had tried to be a good man, but he was scared that it would all be forgotten when he was gone. One quiet Tuesday evening in November, Thomas became very sick. Sarah stayed with him through the night, holding his hand and making sure he was comfortable. His breathing became shallow and his eyes grew dim. In his final moments, Thomas whispered to Sarah the words that would change everything. He said, "I just hope someone will visit my grave someday so I will not be alone forever." Thomas Bennett died peacefully that night with Sarah holding his hand. She was the only person there to say goodbye to this good man who had given so much to his country and had loved his family so deeply. As Sarah filled out the necessary paperwork and made the arrangements for his burial, she could not stop thinking about his last words. She knew she had to do something to make sure Thomas would not be forgotten. Sarah could not sleep that night after Thomas passed away. She kept hearing his final words over and over again in her mind. "I just hope someone will visit my grave someday so I will not be alone forever." Those words echoed through her thoughts as she lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling. She had seen many residents pass away during her 3 years at Sunset Care Home, but none had affected her quite like Thomas. The next morning, Sarah went to work with heavy eyes and a troubled heart. She moved through her daily routine, checking on other residents and giving out medications, but her mind kept drifting back to Thomas. During her lunch break, she sat alone in the staff room and pulled out her phone. She opened her social media account and stared at the blank screen, wondering what she could possibly write. Sarah was not someone who usually shared personal stories online. She mostly used social media to keep in touch with old friends and look at pictures of her nieces and nephews, but something deep inside her told her that Thomas's story needed to be heard. She began typing slowly, choosing each word carefully. "Yesterday I lost a resident who was very special to me," she wrote. "His name was Thomas Bennett, and he was 94 years old. Thomas was a war hero who fought bravely for our country when he was just 19. He came home and built a beautiful life with his wife, Mary. They had 2 children and were very happy together for many years." Sarah paused and looked around the empty staff room. She could hear the sounds of the care home continuing around her, but she felt like she was in her own little bubble. She continued typing, feeling the words flow from her heart onto the screen. Thomas lived alone for many years after his wife died. His children moved away and stopped visiting him. When he came to live at our care home 2 years ago, he had no family left who cared about him. In all the time I knew him, no one ever came to see him. No one ever called, no one ever sent him a card or letter. Thomas was one of the kindest, most gentle people I've ever met. He never complained about anything. He was always polite and grateful for everything we did for him. He would tell me stories about the war and about his beloved wife Mary. He was so proud of his service to his country and so proud of the life he had built. But Thomas was also very lonely and very afraid. He was afraid that when he died, no one would remember him. He worried that his grave would be empty and forgotten. Last night, as Thomas was dying, he whispered to me that he hoped someone would visit his grave someday so he would not be alone forever. Sarah stopped typing and wiped tears from her eyes. She looked at what she had written and wondered if she should really post it. Would anyone care about an old man they had never met? Would anyone understand why this mattered so much to her? She took a deep breath and continued writing. "Thomas' funeral is scheduled for next Friday at Greenwood Cemetery. I know this might sound strange, but I am asking if anyone reading this could come to his funeral. Thomas deserves to have people there who will remember him and honor his life. He deserves to know that his service to our country mattered. He deserves to not be alone. If you cannot come to the funeral, maybe you could visit his grave sometime. Maybe you could leave a flower or just say a prayer. Thomas was a good man who gave everything for his country and his family. He should not be forgotten." Sarah read through her post one more time. Her hands were shaking as she pressed the share button. She put her phone away and went back to work, not knowing if anyone would even see what she had written, but something amazing began to happen almost immediately. Within an hour, Sarah's phone started buzzing with notifications. People were sharing her post and adding their own comments. A woman named Jennifer wrote that her grandfather had also been a war veteran who died alone, and she wished someone had honored him the way Sarah was honoring Thomas. An elderly man named Robert shared the post and wrote about how he was also a veteran and how important it was to remember those who had served. He said he would try to attend Thomas' funeral if he could. A young mother named Lisa said she would bring her children to the funeral to teach them about respecting their elders and honoring veterans. As the day went on, more and more people began sharing Sarah's post. Local news stations picked up the story and started calling the care home asking for interviews. Sarah was amazed and a little overwhelmed by the response. She had never expected so many people to care about Thomas. By evening, the post had been shared thousands of times. People from all over the country were commenting and sharing their own stories about elderly relatives who had been forgotten. Some people shared pictures of their grandparents who had served in the war. Others wrote about lonely elderly neighbors they had lost touch with. Over the years, the story began appearing on local television news programs. A reporter from Channel 7 came to interview Sarah at the care home. She was nervous about being on television, but she knew this was important for Thomas. She told the reporter about what a wonderful man Thomas had been and how much his service to the country had meant to him. The reporter asked Sarah why she had decided to share Thomas's story on social media. Sarah thought for a moment and then said that Thomas had been forgotten by his own family, but that did not mean he should be forgotten by everyone. She said that all elderly people deserve to be remembered and honored, especially those who had sacrificed so much for their country. The news story aired that evening, and even more people began sharing Thomas' story. The funeral home that was handling Thomas' burial called Sarah to tell her that they were getting calls from people asking about the funeral arrangements. The cemetery where Thomas was to be buried said they were preparing for a much larger crowd than they had originally expected. Social media pages dedicated to honoring veterans began sharing Thomas' story. Military organizations started posting about the importance of remembering fallen and forgotten heroes. Churches began asking their congregations to pray for Thomas and to consider attending his funeral. But the most touching responses came from ordinary people who simply wanted to make sure Thomas would not be alone. An elderly woman wrote that she had been taking care of her husband who had dementia and that reading about Thomas reminded her how precious every elderly person is. A teenager wrote that he had never thought much about war veterans before, but that Thomas' story made him want to learn more about history and honor those who had served. By the end of the week, Sarah's post had been shared over 50,000 times. The funeral home had to make special arrangements for the large crowd that was expected. The cemetery prepared extra parking and brought in additional staff. Local police said they would help direct traffic and ensure everyone could pay their respects safely. Sarah could hardly believe what was happening. She had simply wanted to honor one lonely old man, and somehow it had turned into something much bigger than she ever imagined. Thomas' story was touching hearts all across the country and bringing people together in a way that Sarah had never seen before. At Kensington Palace, the morning routine was always the same. Staff members would arrive early to prepare briefings for Prince William and Catherine. They would sort through hundreds of letters from the public, review news reports, and organize the royal couple's schedule for the day. But on this particular Thursday morning, something unusual happened that would change everything. Rebecca Thompson had been working as a communications assistant at the palace for 2 years. She was responsible for monitoring social media and news stories that might be relevant to the royal family. As she scrolled through a computer screen with her morning coffee, she came across a story that made her stop and read more carefully. The headline read, "Local nurse asks public to honor forgotten war veteran." Rebecca clicked on the article and he began reading about Thomas Bennett and Sarah Mitchell. As she read about Thomas' lonely death and his final words, she felt tears forming in her eyes. This was not the kind of story she usually brought to the attention of the royal couple, but something about it touched her heart deeply. Rebecca had grown up listening to stories about her own grandfather who had served in the war. He had died when she was young, but her grandmother had always told her about what a brave and kind man he had been. Reading about Thomas reminded her of those stories and made her think about all the veterans who might be forgotten and alone. Printed out the article and several of the social media posts that people had shared about Thomas. She also found the news video where Sarah had been interviewed. Rebecca knew that Prince William and Catherine received hundreds of requests every day from people asking them to attend events or support causes. Most of these requests had to be declined because there were simply too many and the royal schedule was always packed with official duties. But Rebecca felt that this story was different. She had worked at the palace long enough to know what kinds of stories and causes the royal couple cared about most. Prince William had always been passionate about supporting veterans and military families. Catherine had shown deep compassion for elderly people and had visited many care homes during her official duties. When Rebecca knocked on the office door of David Harrison, the senior communications director, she was nervous but determined. David was a busy man who did not like to have his time wasted. He looked up from his desk with a slightly impatient expression as Rebecca entered. "David, I know this is unusual," she began, "but I think Prince William and Catherine should know about this story." She handed him the printed articles and explained what she had read about Thomas Bennett and the growing response from the public. David read through the materials with interest. He had been working with the royal family for over 10 years and had developed a good sense of what would appeal to them. As he read about Thomas' story and saw the thousands of comments from people who wanted to honor this forgotten veteran, he began to understand why Rebecca had brought this to his attention. "This is quite remarkable," he said after finishing the articles. "The public response is extraordinary." David made some notes and told Rebecca that he would include this story in the morning briefing with the royal couple. He warned her not to get her hopes up because the palace received many touching stories and they could not respond to all of them. An hour later, Prince William and Catherine sat in their private office reviewing the day's briefing materials. They had meetings scheduled with charity representatives, a visit to a local school, and several other official duties. David presented the usual items for their review and then paused before mentioning the story about Thomas Bennett. "Your Royal Highnesses, there is one more item I wanted to bring to your attention," he said. "It is not an official request, but rather a story that has been gaining significant attention on social media." He explained about Thomas Bennett and read some of the key details from Sarah's post. Prince William listened carefully as David described Thomas' military service and his lonely death. When David mentioned Thomas' final words about hoping someone would visit his grave, Prince William exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine. They both had grandparents who had served in the war and understood the importance of honoring veterans. Catherine asked to see the social media posts and news articles. As she read through them, she was struck by the genuine emotion in people's responses. She saw comments from other veterans who said they understood Thomas' loneliness. She read messages from families who had elderly relatives in care homes. She saw posts from young people who said the story had made them think differently about respecting their elders. Prince William was particularly moved by Sarah's description of Thomas' pride in his military service. He had met thousands of veterans during his official duties, and he knew how important it was to them to feel that their sacrifice had been remembered and valued. The idea that Thomas had died worrying that he would be forgotten troubled him deeply. "When is the funeral?" Catherine asked. David told her it was scheduled for the following Friday at Greenwood Cemetery and that hundreds of people were planning to attend based on the social media response. Catherine looked at her husband, and they seemed to communicate without words in the way that couples who have been married for many years often do. "Clear our schedule for Friday morning," Prince William said quietly. "We want to attend this funeral." David was surprised, but not shocked. He had seen the royal couple make spontaneous decisions before when they were deeply moved by a cause or story. He made notes about what arrangements would need to be made. Catherine asked for more information about Sarah Mitchell and Sunset Care, whom she wanted to understand more about the people who had cared for Thomas in his final years. David said he would have his staff gather more details and coordinate with local authorities about the funeral. Arrangements thought the decision to attend Thomas' funeral was kept quiet for the rest of that day. The palace staff began making discreet inquiries about security arrangements and logistics. They contacted local police and the funeral home to discuss how to manage the situation without disrupting the service for the other attendees. Rebecca could hardly believe it when David told her that the royal couple had decided to attend the funeral. She had hoped they might send flowers or a message, but never imagined they would attend in person. David reminded her that this information needed to remain confidential until the proper announcements could be made. By Thursday evening, everything was arranged. The palace would make a brief announcement Friday morning just before the funeral to avoid creating a media circus that might overshadow the purpose of the event. Security teams had visited the cemetery and funeral home to make necessary preparations. Prince William and Catherine spent Thursday evening reading more about Thomas's life and military service. They wanted to understand as much as possible about the man they would be honoring. Catherine selected a simple bouquet of white roses from their private garden to place on Thomas' grave. That as they prepared for bed that night, both William and Catherine felt that attending Thomas' funeral was one of the most important things they would do that week. It was not an official royal duty or a political obligation. It was simply the right thing to do for a man who had served his country with honor and deserved to be remembered with dignity and respect. Friday morning arrived with gray clouds hanging low over Greenwood Cemetery. Sarah Mitchell had barely slept the night before thinking about Thomas and the incredible response his story had received. She arrived at the cemetery 2 hours before the funeral was scheduled to begin and was amazed by what she saw. Cars were already lining the streets around the cemetery even though it was still early morning. People were walking through the gates carrying flowers, small flags, and handmade signs. Sarah recognized some faces from the care home staff who had come to pay their respects, but most of the people gathering were complete strangers who had been touched by Thomas' story. An elderly man in a wheelchair was being pushed by what looked like his grandson. The old man wore a military uniform with several medals pinned to his chest. Sarah approached them and learned that the man was a 92-year-old veteran named Frank who had served in the same war as Thomas. Frank had asked his grandson to drive him 3 hours so he could honor a fellow soldier near the cemetery entrance. A group of teenagers stood together looking somewhat out of place among the older crowd. Sarah walked over to them and discovered they were students from a local high school. Their history teacher had told them about Thomas's story and they had asked permission to skip their morning classes to attend the funeral. One of the students, a girl named Emma, told Sarah that reading about Thomas had made her want to visit her own elderly neighbors more often. Families with young children were scattered throughout the growing crowd. Parents were explaining to their kids why they had come and what it meant to honor someone who had served their country. Sarah watched as a mother knelt down to talk to a 5-year-old son who was holding a small American flag. The mother was telling him about how brave soldiers like Thomas had fought to keep their families safe. By 9:30 in the morning, hundreds of people had gathered at the cemetery. The funeral director, Mr. Peterson, approached Sarah looking both grateful and overwhelmed. He told her that in 30 years of conducting funerals he had never seen anything like this. The original plan had been for a simple graveside service with perhaps a dozen attendees. Now they were preparing for what looked like it might be close to 1,000 people. Sarah felt proud and emotional as she looked around at all the people who had come to honor Thomas, but she also felt nervous about whether everything would go smoothly. She had never organized anything like this before and was worried about disappointing all these kind people who had taken time from their lives to be here. At 10 o'clock, Mr. Peterson asked everyone to gather around Thomas' gravesite. The crowd formed a large circle that stretched much further than anyone had expected. People stood quietly and respectfully waiting for the service to begin. Sarah had prepared a few words to say about Thomas, but she felt intimidated speaking to so many people. Just as Mr. Peterson was about to begin the service, a murmur went through the crowd. People near the cemetery entrance were turning and pointing toward the road. Sarah looked in that direction and saw several black cars with official license plates pulling up to the curb. Her heart began beating faster as she realized what was happening. Security officers in dark suits stepped out of the first car and began scanning the area. Then the middle car door opened, and Prince William emerged, followed immediately by Catherine. Sarah felt like she might faint as she watched. The royal couple walked through the cemetery gates toward Thomas' grave. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as William and Catherine approached. They were dressed simply and respectfully, with William in a dark navy suit and Catherine in a black coat. Catherine carried a small bouquet of white roses that looked like they had been picked from a private garden rather than purchased from a florist. Sarah was frozen in place, not knowing what to do or say. She had never expected this to happen and had no idea how to react. But Prince William walked directly toward her with a kind smile and extended his hand. "You must be Sarah," he said warmly. "Thank you for everything you did for Thomas and for sharing his story with all of us." Catherine joined them and also shook Sarah's hand. She told Sarah that they had been deeply moved by Thomas' story and felt honored to attend his funeral. She said that what Sarah had done by caring for Thomas and then sharing his story showed the very best of human kindness. The royal couple then walked to Thomas' grave, where they knelt down together. William placed his hand on the headstone while Catherine laid the white roses at its base. They remained there for several minutes in quiet prayer or reflection. The entire crowd of hundreds of people stood in complete silence watching this touching moment. When William and Catherine stood up, William addressed the crowd in a clear voice that carried across the cemetery. He spoke about Thomas's military service and the sacrifice he had made for his country. He talked about the importance of remembering veterans and ensuring that none of them are forgotten. He said that Thomas' story had reminded everyone of the debt they owed to the generation that had fought for their freedom. Catherine also spoke to the crowd about the importance of caring for elderly people in their communities. She said that Thomas' loneliness in his final years was something that too many elderly people experienced. She encouraged everyone to reach out to elderly neighbors and relatives who might be feeling forgotten or alone. But what happened next surprised everyone, including the royal couple themselves. Instead of leaving after their brief remarks, William and Catherine began moving through the crowd, speaking individually with people who had come to honor Thomas. They spent time with the elderly veterans, thanking them for their service. They spoke with the families, explaining to the children why what they were doing was important. Catherine spent several minutes talking with a group of high school students, praising them for taking an interest in honoring veterans. William had a long conversation with Frank, the 92-year-old veteran in the wheelchair. Frank told William stories about his own military service, and William listened with genuine interest and respect. The royal couple moved slowly through the crowd, making sure to acknowledge as many people as possible. They accepted flowers and handmade cards from children. They posed for pictures with veterans and their families. They listened to stories from people who had their own experiences with elderly relatives who had been forgotten or lonely. Sarah followed behind them, amazed by how naturally William and Catherine connected with everyone they met. She had expected them to make a brief appearance and then leave quickly. Instead, they seemed genuinely interested in meeting the people who had been touched by Thomas' story and wanted to spend time honoring his memory properly. As the morning continued, more people kept arriving at the cemetery. Word had somehow spread that the royal couple was attending Thomas' funeral, and people were coming from surrounding towns to be part of this extraordinary event. The simple funeral for a forgotten veteran had become something much larger and more meaningful than anyone could have imagined. As the afternoon sun began to break through the gray clouds at Greenwood Cemetery, something magical was happening that no one had planned or expected. Prince William and Catherine had been moving through the crowd for nearly 3 hours now and showed no signs of wanting to leave. What had started as a simple funeral service had transformed into something that felt like a community, a celebration of life and remembrance. Sarah watched in wonder as she saw conversations happening all around her, between people who had never met before. The royal couple had somehow created an atmosphere where everyone felt comfortable sharing their stories and connecting with one another. Veterans were talking with young families. Teenagers were listening to elderly people tell stories about the war. Children were asking questions about history and learning about the importance of honoring those who had served. Near the old oak tree at the edge of the cemetery, Sarah noticed a particularly touching scene unfolding. An elderly woman with silver hair and a black dress was standing alone, looking uncertain and emotional. Catherine had noticed her too and was walking over to speak with her. Sarah moved closer so she could hear their conversation. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Swalsh and told Catherine that she had lived next door to Thomas Bennett more than 20 years ago. She explained that she had lost touch with him after she moved to a different neighborhood to be closer to her daughter. Margaret said she had seen Thomas' story on the news and had come to the funeral to say goodbye and to apologize for not keeping in touch with him over the years. Catherine listened carefully as Margaret described how kind Thomas had been to her family when her children were young. Margaret remembered how Thomas used to help fix things around her house after her husband died. She told Catherine about how Thomas would always wave to her children when they played in the yard, and how he had given them vegetables from his garden every summer. They should have visited him at the care home, Margaret said with tears in her eyes. I should have made sure he knew that we remembered him and cared about him. I have felt so guilty since I heard about his story. Catherine reached out and took Margaret's hands gently. She told Margaret that Thomas would have understood and that what mattered most was that she had come today to honor his memory. As Catherine and Margaret continued talking, their conversation was overheard by other people nearby. Soon, a small group had gathered around them, and other people began sharing their own stories about Thomas or about elderly people in their own lives who they had lost touch with over the years. A middle-aged man named David told the group that Thomas had built a bookshelf for his family when he was a child. He remembered how careful and skilled Thomas had been with his woodworking and how proud his parents had been of the beautiful piece of furniture. David said he still had that bookshelf in his home and that his own children used it now. A woman named Helen shared that Thomas had been friends with her father, who had also served in the war. She remembered the two men sitting on her father's front porch, talking about their experiences and supporting each other through difficult times. Helen said that after her father died, Thomas had continued to visit her mother for several years, until his own health began to fail. Prince William had overheard these stories and joined the group around Margaret. He told them that hearing these memories of Thomas made him feel like he was getting to know the man better. William said that it was clear Thomas had touched many lives throughout his years, and that his impact on his community had been much greater than he probably ever realized. The sharing of stories continued for another hour as more people joined the circle around Margaret. Someone had brought folding chairs from their car, and the elderly attendees were able to sit down while they talked. Children sat on the grass listening to the adults share memories and stories about Thomas and about other veterans they had known. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah realized that something truly special was happening. The funeral had become a gathering where people were not just honoring Thomas but were also connecting with each other in meaningful ways. She saw phone numbers being exchanged between people who wanted to stay in touch. She heard plans being made for people to visit elderly neighbors and relatives they had not seen in too long. The teenagers from the high school were asking the elderly veterans if they could interview them for a school project about local history. Several of the veterans seemed delighted at the prospect of sharing their stories with young people who were genuinely interested in learning about their experiences. Near Thomas' gravesite, a spontaneous memorial was growing as people continued to bring flowers, flags, and personal mementos. Someone had brought a small American flag that had belonged to their own grandfather who had served in the war. Another person left a handwritten note thanking Thomas for his service. Children were drawing pictures to leave at the gravesite. Sarah noticed that Prince William and Catherine seemed as moved by what they were witnessing as everyone else was. They had not just attended a funeral, they had helped create a community moment that was bringing people together in a way that none of them had experienced before. As the sun began to set, Catherine made an announcement to the group that had gathered around Margaret. She said that she and William had been deeply honored to be part of this day and to learn about Thomas's life through the stories that people had shared. She said that what they had witnessed was exactly what Thomas would have wanted his legacy to be, bringing people together and reminding them of the importance of caring for one another. William added that he hoped everyone would continue to honor Thomas' memory by reaching out to elderly people in their communities who might be lonely or forgotten. He said that the best way to ensure that Thomas had not died in vain was to make sure that no other veteran or elderly person would have to face the loneliness that Thomas had experienced. Before leaving, the royal couple made one final gesture that brought many people to tears. They asked Sarah if she would be willing to coordinate with other attendees to establish a regular visiting program at Sunset Care Home and other local care facilities. Catherine said that the palace would be happy to help promote such a program and to recognize volunteers who participated in it. As Prince William and Catherine finally prepared to leave the cemetery, they were surrounded by hundreds of people who began clapping spontaneously. The applause grew louder and more sustained as people realized that this remarkable day was coming to an end. Many people in the crowd were crying as they clapped, not just because they were sad to see the royal couple leave, but because they had been part of something truly meaningful. Sarah stood near Thomas' grave as the royal cars pulled away and looked around at all the people who were still gathered in the cemetery. Some were cleaning up the area and making sure everything was left neat and respectful. Others were still talking in small groups, making plans to stay connected with the new friends they had made. As the last of the attendees began to leave, Sarah remained alone at Thomas's grave for a few minutes. She looked down at all the flowers and mementos that covered the ground around his headstone and smiled through her tears. Thomas Bennett had gotten his wish in the most beautiful way possible. He would never be alone or forgotten again, and his story would continue to inspire acts of kindness and community for years to come.